Shepherds, welcome back, and if you're new here, hello! Winter's in full swing here at the cabin, and one of my favorite indoor activities is working with all that wool that I harvested and cleaned during springtime rush. In this video, I wanted to share a fast, rewarding project. Not only is it good for a foundational shape to build multiple skills, but also it's a main component in many projects, gifts, and home decor. I know I've been focusing on the dairy aspect of raising sheep, but sheep are what I call pillars of a farmstead or cottage life. Sheep, like some breeds of goats and cattle, are dual or even multi-purpose. So with chickens and pigs, we certainly get the joy out of raising them, but also eggs and meat. But with some sheep, like goats and cattle, not only do we get milk products, but we can also harvest their fiber. So for today, I wanted to touch upon one of the three pillars of multi-purpose sheep keeping. I hope to make this a really fun and relaxing video. For materials, we'll need a foam pad, brace or felt pad, needles, and thumb protectors, our core wool, and outer layer wool. Now, I'm going to turn this wool into a cat toy, but this shape works really well for coasters, banners, ornaments, dryer balls, decor, and even larger projects. Speaking of wool, I want to approach this from many angles, not only for those who currently have sheep, but also for our friends that are sheepless. So when choosing wool to felt, whether from your own flock or that of neighbors, most any types, length, grades, and microns will do. The finer or higher the grade, the easier it is to felt and maneuver your wool into felting details. A good visual and hands-on way to tell if it's good for felting is to observe the crimp, thickness of the fiber, softness of the handle. The softer wools often have a very fine crimp, and wavier wool tends to be coarser. I hope you can see here the detail of the fine wool fibers. I'm pulling these from different parts of our sheep. So with heritage breeds, we often have many types of wool in one sheep. Some are even dual coated, and there tends to be a coarser wool along their bridges versus a softer wool along their neck. If you're working with a modern breed, there's more consistency throughout your fleece, as well as zero guard hair. On that note, in terms of what wool is not good for felting, any type of guard hair, thick, wiry, coarse hair doesn't felt well, as wool is wool nubs, nibs, or neps, any itty-bitty second guts. They're a little too short for this project. We can still work with it, but for now, let's focus on the more common wool types. But what if you don't have wool sheep or fleece on hand? What else can you use to felt? I'm big on making do with what we have. So if you happen to have a breed of sheep, such as a hair sheep, not to worry, there's a soft downy undercoat that you can use for felting. The perfect time for harvesting that wool that I've experienced before is in spring when they blow their coat. It's a lot of work to clean though, and personally not my favorite type of wool to work with. I've seen some really creative alternative sources for felting wool. What have you seen? If you're working with store-bought wool or a felting kit, oftentimes the wool included for felting comes in rolls of comb top, bats, or roving. Most often these are merino-based wool unless you purchase through a breeder or a specialist site. These are really perfect for felting projects. And lastly, we have yarn on hand. We can also tease that out with a cat or dog brush for your felting project, as long as the yarn is wool-based and hasn't been treated with a superwash or other machine washable treatments that prevents felting in the yarn. Here I'm using some wool that I've already picked and carded lightly. It's washed, but if you're using unwashed raw wool, it really helps to wash all that lanolin off and open up those wool fibers so that they can mesh together easier with our needle felting. What happens is that on each strand of the wool are these little scales, and this is what gives some wool that itchy factor that you may feel with some types of wool. And it's really good for felting. If your wool is clumped or still in locked form, it may be helpful to grab a dog or cat brush if you have one on hand, and if you don't have any hand carders, to flick the ends and help open up these strands of wool. I like to use coarser wool for my inner form or decor projects and reserve my finer wool for other projects or detail work here. I'm using lamey or dairy sheep for a core wool. One of the larger problems with dairy sheep as a breed is that oftentimes the focus for the breeders is that of milk production, rather than fine wool production. So they just don't have that super soft wool that you may get with other specifically wool-focused breeds. The dairy that I got lamb from has worked for decades on improving this quality in their dairy sheep, but for the most part, most sheep dairies that I've worked with and that you may encounter focus strictly on milk production and temperament, as the wool market is pretty bad. So we don't blame them. They do what's financially feasible for a small dairy. So even though she's way softer than other dairy sheep that I've had, I still consider Lammy a more of a medium grade wool. For this cat toy, this is perfect. I really want to save my best and finest wool for next to skin projects or spinning. It's just a personal preference, and whatever you have on hand works well. If you look here, you can see a comparison between finer crip, such as that of a Shetland sheep. It's a lot softer versus our coarser sheep. If you look closely, you can see how the fibers themselves are thicker. It's hard to capture on this camera, so hopefully you can pick up on it. If you're using a dual-coated breed, I really recommend removing that guard hair with a comb and reserving that wool for a different project for now. If you're using roving, a bat, or a wool, it helps it tug gently to pull it apart. With pencil roving, if you're pulling on it and find it doesn't separate, slide your hand up just a bit and give it a gentle pull, and the fibers should separate with ease. Where to get felting kits and supplies. So moving on, I picked up this needle felting kit from a fiber festival, and then slowly add more bits and tools over time. Most fiber festivals have some base level kit for needle felting, but I found online to be the best in terms of specific tools. If you are wondering when will water factor in here, this is a dry project. I have tossed my wool balls into the wash to tighten them up even more and then moved them onto the dryer, but we won't need water for this project. Now let's talk needles. In needle felting, the needles are very different than what you may use for a sewing project. Remember all those scales we talked about earlier? Each felting needle has a certain number of barbs or notches, and each one of these barbs catches a strand of wool and mats, pushes, or knits the fibers together into a tangled mass that we call felt. The more barbs a needle has, the faster the felting. Also, for fine detail work, where we may only want to maneuver a few strands of wool or even pull some wool fibers out in a reverse felting needle, all we need is a single barb or so to finally push the fiber where we need it to go. These needles are very sharp and brittle, so it's important to be careful when poking about. When felters say they put their blood, sweat, and tears into their art, they aren't kidding. Felting needles come in various shapes such as a star, spiral, and triangle. Everyone has a preferred shape. The difference is in their cross-section. A star tip looks like a star when sliced in half. A triangle tip looks like a triangle cross-section, and more. I think it helps to work with a few types and see which one's best for your own personal needs and style. So what about needle gauge? The higher the number, the smaller the gauge diameter of the needle. So as the number goes higher, the needle gets thinner. My kit already came with a few different gauges, but if you're getting into needles separately, a 36 gauge needle is considered coarse. 38 gauge is a general all-purpose size. 40 gauge is considered fine, with 42 gauge as the finest. For fine detail work, you may want a higher gauge needle, or when working with very fine fiber. A lower gauge is good for working with a coarse fiber or shaping your general form. And finer needles are good for working with fine wool. But why? If you remember me mentioning the micron count, this is the measurement of the thickness of the individual fiber strands. Fine wool strands are pretty tiny, where coarser wool can even resemble hair. So a thicker gauge needle with a deeper notch or barb allows the needle to catch that thick fiber easily. But what about fine wool? When using a thicker gauge on fine wool projects, it works pretty well, but sometimes it leaves holes in our projects, so this keeps the holes from being visible in our final work. A finer gauge felting needle will still work on coarser wool too, but because the notches or barbs aren't as deep, you may have to work extra hard to get to take. It'll still work though. Also, on the note of needle safety, I've seen a lot of people use felting needles without any handle. This is fine for a project or two, but for me, that pinching motion is super hard on your hands and arm over time and can cause a lot of muscle or tendon injuries. My kit already comes with a wooden handle. I really like it because it helps my hands so much, and I really recommend some sort of large handle for your felting needles, just as something to consider if you really do want to do felting long term. There are some safety felting needles. This one we picked up at a Vibra Festival as well. My kids tried it out because they got tired of poking themselves and they don't like their finger guards. They definitely found it cumbersome. It's not one of their favorite tools to use, but this is just something to be familiar. And how to take this apart, some of these wood handles have a twist mechanism where I'm just slowly twisting here on this one to take it out, and to place the needles in, we just slide them in through each of these holes. And then twist it back together to reassemble it. This smaller piece is actually not a twisting one. We just go ahead and pull it out right here, pop our little needle in, and then slide it back together. So that's how we set up our tools. Let's move on to the next step. For our base, any sort of foam pad, even a felting cloth, a padded cloth, or leather, especially if you're felting on your lab. Some people, especially young folks, I found tend to put caution to the wind and just go ham at their projects. It's okay. Just if they're forceful stabbers, it tends to help to use a thicker foam to protect your tables and leather finger guards. These needles do hurt, exceedingly so, given their size, and an optional tool that some people use is a spare pin. It really helps to hold the piece in place and keep your fingers at a safe distance from the needle tip, but isn't necessary for this time. To get started, I like to compress my wool into a tight ball. When we compress our wool, it keeps the fibers from bouncing around and helps the needles grab each strand. It'll be really lofty, soft, and light at first, and as I'm poking about, I'm using this large tool and I'm just trying to get a general shape. And just start poking away at it with my felting needle. Working around, if there's a part that starts to sink unevenly, I move to a different area. I'm just trying to compress it down as evenly as possible. If we end up focusing too much on one area and it's compressed down and uneven, that's okay. We can just add a little bit of a carded wool out and blanket over it. Then we anchor it in and then continue to shape our ball. If the piece isn't dense or firm enough, we can keep on adding more wool to it and continue to needle it down in the same space to compress this wool and also shrink the size of the wool ball. When piercing our project, we want to make sure that our needles are going straight in and straight out. What happens when we twist or turn or bend our needle, it makes our needle more likely to break. And these needles are not only fragile, but sharp as well, so please be careful. It's okay if your needle breaks. It's pretty common to do. I like to poke and prod mostly on the surface to get my general shape. The needle should enter your project with ease and don't force it. That'll cause it to break too. It should go in and out smoothly. Here I'm starting off by using my multi-prong tool for general work. When I want to add details in, I like to switch to my single prong tool. It just helps in being deliberate in how we place our fibers. It's starting to round up and I'm rotating it around, just piercing below the surface. I'm not piercing all the way through. We only need to go a little bit. If you end up needle felting in one place, you may create a sunken area. So it's important to move around a lot. Let me show you how far I'm going with this needle. As you can see here, I'm really not going in that deep, just barely below the surface. I'm still rolling the wool around and I like to feel how it's nice and tight. The finger guards are really good to help in preventing pokes, but for me it actually gets in the way of feeling about how I'm working with my project. So even though I am saying wear finger guards, especially if you're starting off, I really don't like using them. So I'm rolling the wool around and keeping it nice and tight and compressed with my hand while I'm piercing and poking with my needle felting with the other hand. There are 3 main angles that we approach our project with: perpendicular to compress and shape, a 45-degree angle if I want to attach more wool and anchor it in that piece without compressing it down. And if you want to blend 2 pieces together or blend 2 colors together, it helps to go at 180 degrees. So our ball is coming along very nicely. It's very soft and bouncy still. I know it's like that at first. I personally really like a firmer felt, but this is really all a personal preference. So if you like them soft and bouncy, keep them soft and bouncy. If you're going to be using these balls as part of a wreath or a tassel or anything you need to poke it through, it does help to have it a little bit looser so you can pierce it through and string it up with your needle. I'm just going around here, feeling for any soft spots, bouncy bits, anything that feels a little loose that I want to tamp down. I really want to make this something that can handle a little kitten playing for a long period of time. Once I'm done, there's a few ways we can finish it, either through trimming with scissors, or a dog hair trimmer, or even ironing it down with like a felting iron. So let's go ahead and test this out. What do you think? Would your pets enjoy a homemade toy? What kind of projects do you think you would want to enter into it? If you made it this far, thank you so much. Don't forget to tag me if you post any of your projects. I really love to see what you do. If you found this video helpful or relaxing, I really appreciate it. If you like or subscribe, it really helps me out and you get to see more videos. Until the next one, stay soft, stay warm, and most of all, stay true to yourself. Ta-ta.